Welcome back and happy Monday. I'm going to start. I feel like I always start my videos with a sigh, which is kind of like, what is your life like that these ideas almost drag you down before you can be lifted by them? But it's a good thing to kind of think about because sometimes we believe that we're facilitated towards a vocation or a calling and we don't really know what it is and what the context it'll be relevant for. And so we kind of just go with it and just assume that, if it's not relevant in like a relatively present time, maybe in the next little while or in the near future, it'll have some application. So that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to talk a little bit, or kind of just build on my last video where I was talking a little bit about some kind of gray area. So right now we're thinking about sexual identities, we're thinking about gender identities, and then that kind of gender fluidity where if we were to take out language, which was like he, they, their, she, and then just pause that because that's like new language that I almost hinted at. We need new language to kind of understand how to talk about all of this. But then just work towards different language, meaning like what new ideas do we need to kind of think about and what language is going to support it. So it's almost like we need new definitions and then we need a word to kind of describe what that definition is and then what's the reality of it. So I was reading, I mentioned in I think one of my other playlists, the whole Quran is it's divided in chapters, and then there are actually 30 parts, and within each part there might be one chapter or there might be several chapters. The longer chapters tend to be ones that were revealed or inspired in Medina, which was the city of the Prophet after he was about 50 years old. And they usually talk about how to build a civilization, so all the interactions that we're supposed to kind of instill in ourselves as norms. So before that, though, it's almost like this is a new habit and I'm kind of slow to adapt to it or even accept it. So that was like the whole process after the first 10 years, which were in Mecca. Those tend to be shorter chapters and they're usually near the end of the Quran, and they talk about oneness and how we're supposed to contemplate the universe and how we're supposed to think about our existence relative to the universe. All of that because the community there was primitive and they were usually adapted or habituated to worshipping idols. So kind of a similar story or narrative to that of Ibrahim, that of Noah, and it's almost something that we almost fall into by accident. Like if you think right now about technology and cyborgs, you can think, okay, we built it and we almost want to worship it. Not like pray to it, as it were, but it's almost, I want to rely on it to help inform how I live my life. And then feeling that it exists, I feel like I have to panic. And that's a natural reaction because we're so habituated to something, especially if it's a younger generation. This is all they know. And if they haven't come from a tradition that is accustomed to understanding that outside of technology, there is a sustainer in the world. And if they don't talk about it, then it's just like it's not in our subconscious in a way that's almost expressed yet. So it may have been in a subconscious, several lifetimes ago, but it's not right now because we haven't really talked about it and we have no way of having reference for it yet. So one of the chapters is Yasin. It's called the heart of the Quran. And in it, it's this verse, and it says, like if you contemplate the signs of God, you can, or the signs of the universe, you can see how wording this phrase is almost like it gives you pause. And it says, and a verse of, or a miracle for those who want to contemplate is the night, and from the night we shed the day or the daytime. So you think, okay, well, when I think about the night, I don't see light. So you think, well, why? And then you say, well, because the way the earth is situated, it's kind of away from the sun, so I don't see the sun. It's almost directed away from the sun, so there's no light. Okay, so then you think, okay, I mean, the light is still there, it's just on the other side of the world. So you think, okay. And then you're almost like, I don't know what to think after that. Like I'm seeing light and I'm seeing day, and then where's the shedding? And then you think of a snake, and then you think, okay, so there's change. So sometimes we talked about sometimes when you sleep, your spirit leaves your body. Sorry, your soul leaves your body, your spirit remains because you're still breathing. And I mean, what happens during the night in one part of the world that maybe doesn't happen in the other side of the world? And what are dreams? And then you think, wow, I can really like go far out of the world with this, or just kind of contemplate this from like a third party. If I was like a satellite somewhere in the world and I'm just looking at the universe and trying to think about how does the universe work and why does it work the way it does. Now, if you don't understand, let's say this was back to the primitive society and they don't have these satellites, or they don't have an image of what the galaxy is or what the world looks like, they can think of night being a time of peace, or it's serene, where people tend to fall asleep, and if they have like an intimate companion, they're finding solace with them, or they're falling asleep in a sort of reassured way. And then they think, and daytime is a good day because, it's a good thing, or a good construct, as it were, because, we're working towards earning a living so that we can remain within some kind of comfort. And so life progresses itself. But if you think, if I don't have solace at night, and I don't have a way of thinking of the day as something that gives solace, I almost have neither night nor day. So what do I have? And then you can actually think of somebody who's like in outer space, or just like suspended in air. Like, it's just confusion. Like, what do I? So this is a way of saying that sometimes if we don't have something that's almost a way of explaining something in a conundrum, or like a puzzling way, or a perplexing way, it doesn't break us out of a habitual way of thinking. And we won't know that we're actually in a habituated way of thinking unless we have something like this. And that's basically what the Quran is. It's just all metaphors. You'll have some ways of interpreting something literally, but the overall idea behind any kind of scripture is to read it metaphorically. That way it'll continue to be just like a spring of new ideas for you, depending on what walk of life you are, what a particular scenario is for you at a given time. And then it won't necessarily be a question of what's the validity of Muhammad and his friends, and where was the geography and what happened. Those are important questions to deliberate, and because we know that if we aren't aware of what the actual context was, it'll be hard for us to think of it from like 2023, right, from this lens, and then go back there and then think, all I think right now is from like civilization and then primitive, and I think I don't really know how to almost overlap the two, or like create some kind of overlay so that I can say, how do I compare the two, and how do I allow excuses for what they had to go through and the way they grappled with their reality versus what I'm kind of confronted with. So I'm going to wonder again about sexuality and why, as women, so at the time of the Prophet, he was trying to, some women, it sounded like Khadija Shirdi seemed to have some kind of prominent position in society, because he worked for her before getting to know her. But outside of that, we weren't really sure of what the general context was for women, like what the climate was, or like the political kind of climate outside of maybe they were concubines, maybe they didn't have all these rights. So if you think, God is almost allowing for that. He's saying women can be like earth for you. And so you think of earth now. If you want to till earth, or you want to make it ready or fertile so that you can grow vegetables, for example, right? You're not going to, throw plastic, like right now, if we're thinking, you're going to make sure that it's nutrient rich. So you might want to have a compost bin, right? And then you're steadily building and enriching the soil. So that's basically what it's saying. It's as though to say, if you had to go to war and, part of the booty was, the women are bought and sold, or property. So you almost won a woman. How would you want to treat her? So he's like, so the narrative suggests you have this new life in your life that can work with you in a compassionate way, but it's almost, you get what you give. So whatever you put in, you're going to almost receive. And because they were almost kind of known to be harsh already, it was like, we're going to have to figure this out in almost like trial and error kind of fashion. And the fact that the Prophet was there and known to be a compassionate and merciful and trustworthy person was already, it's almost like, this is encouraging that we have this kind of role model to allow for this. So if we bring this now back to this today, and if we were to read that verse, that women are like earth and you can till, people will be like, that sounds really like, your ideas might go like in a lot of different directions, as though like, wow, they don't really treat women very kindly. But if you think, from a present day, you'd say, it makes sense that we still have that kind of, we're not really sure how to place like an egalitarian perspective to men and women. There's like, we can talk about it, but then sometimes we end up falling into these gender roles that are still kind of stereotypical. So how do you overcome that, and why would we? So the reason I'm starting with sexuality is that there still tends to be that stigma around women who are not virgins, who are from a traditional family and try to find somebody to marry or to live with. They almost feel like they're already sort of like blacklisted somewhere. And I don't really know how, it's a very contentious issue because we think of Mary and we think of, I mean, her community almost reacted to her in the same way. And it's almost to say, we're going to be faced with that stigma throughout time. So how would you want to think about it differently? And that's all it is. Like if you think, well, if I'm a woman, I mean, it's easier for me now because I'm 40 years old. So I have a little bit more life experience than somebody who might be 14 or 15 or 18, right? She might not, depending on her family, have like anyone to support her yet. But from my perspective as 40, I used to think that way. I used to be like, yeah, I have to kind of keep myself almost secluded in a way to figure out, who do I want to end up living with. And I've already almost kind of narrowed out like who I wouldn't want to marry, because I think the way I think of myself is a very comprehensive way of living. And if somebody doesn't already embody the goals that I'm kind of working towards, I don't think it would be a very successful relationship anyway. Now, 20 or 22 years later, my ideas have completely changed, where I'm thinking we all think the same way in a majority of the world, where we want values that are going to help us live in a kind of almost compatible way. Like well, I want to say there's not very many people who are belligerent and saying, my way is always going to be the right way. In a postmodern world, we want to almost inculcate in ourselves and in others the idea of there is an ultimate truth that we know is God sustains the world, but He wants us to have relative truth. We will say the Quran itself is so open to interpretation that you have to understand what the context is to understand how to derive a conclusion from some obstacle or some conflict or some big question mark that you're trying to overcome or kind of decide how to find a solution for. So if you go back and think, okay, so at 18 you thought you've already kind of narrowed down who you might want to kind of see yourself with. But then at 40, you're thinking, you know what, if I just meet any random person who anybody would have thought we never would have seen you with this person, that's good. Like for me, that's thank goodness, because I've progressed enough to say I have had my ideas almost formed by my socializing parents, or like their parenting styles and their tradition that they came from. And I was slow to almost allow myself to acculturate to broader society here in North America. And then I've accommodated in some ways and said, well, I'll hold on to this. I won't hold on to that. And I'll keep some of my tradition. I've assimilated in other ways where I said, I've completely tore down any barriers or boundaries. And I feel like maybe I've been here as though some of my friends that I went to school with, like 3 or 4 generations here. And I don't know how to argue for young women who may be in traditional families who are trying to be supported by what I'm saying, but are still kind of confronted with a patriarchal way of seeing it that says, no, you're not allowed. So being postmodern, I can't enforce and say, well, this is the way it should be. And, that's the end, because it goes back to what I said yesterday or my last video, where if someone is progressive and they've almost allowed themselves to be in the world to validate the way they feel and the way they want to be, then we shouldn't force that on somebody who's still kind of timid and still learning how to make meaning for themselves towards that kind of progress, as it were. And it's not to say that this progressive embodiment of a population doesn't esteem this tradition in any way, because it's almost, they had to have that process through tradition to get to where they are. And we're just at different levels of, it's not really a race, but we're just different levels of that trend, as it were. So then the question becomes, I don't know how to support women. Like when I worked at the school board, I was an early childhood educator. That was a supply. So as occasional, I'd go into like a lot of different schools, and some had more predominantly Muslim population of students, and you can tell because they'd have like the traditional headscarf or traditional cultural wear that didn't necessarily signify just that they were Muslim, but it was a culture on top of the fact that they were Muslim. So you could have other girls or boys that, they maybe looked a little bit less like they were from a certain culture, but they may be Muslim, but you could only know by their name. So I don't know like, I almost want to say I tend to be kind of picking on the ones that maybe newcomers and are just like, we just want to hold on to our tradition, and please, like, slow down and don't force us out of, our comfort zone just yet. And then maybe I'm neglecting the ones that have been here for, many years and are like, yeah, yeah, like, we don't see that there's a problem. Like, we're maybe on par with what you're thinking. So this is kind of where I'm almost testing what my audience or my viewers would think too, and just to see what the general feedback is, because knowing where we can stand from a religious perspective when confronted with a bigger societal question that's going to eventually be something families within a traditional context have to kind of ponder, is important. And it's also something we shouldn't delay, right? Because we might say, yeah, it doesn't apply to us. Like, our kids will never, confront that. But that's a fallacy. Like, if you can think, yeah, maybe at a young age, nobody will understand what the gravity of contemplating those questions are. But they're getting so aware at like a much younger age. Sure, like, abstract thinking doesn't actually become like crystallized maybe until after age 13. But still, they're coming to contact with, like, the jargon, like, they're watching TV, they're understanding, my friends do this, my friends' parents do this, we're talking about it at school, we're hearing stories. They're not going to be able to kind of create themselves and an other for very long before they start to feel uncomfortable about it and not want to do that anymore. And if they are trying to accommodate and assimilate, that's very healthy for them. And we want to encourage that as parents, or like as these almost kind of traditional viewpoints from maybe not parents, but maybe like it could be family friends who are new and saying, why do your kids do that? And you want to be able to support your kids and not feel like you're kind of eroding their self-esteem and their self-confidence as it's starting to kind of come alive. So if you think back to that verse now that I was talking about, where night and day almost like are shed from each other and it's just confusion, you can wonder about, well, why is there so much taboo around religion and sexuality? And when I was at the University of Guelph, I had taken a class on, I think it was adult development or adolescent development. And I had to write an essay on just like any subject that adolescents would have to kind of wonder about. And I remember I wrote two of them. One of them was about cannabis, and the other one was about sexual fantasies. And at the time, I was just like, I learned a lot. But this was 2008, so it was a fair amount of time ago. But there wasn't very much literature on it. And so you almost want to take that back and say, what is it about wanting to almost be in a safe enough environment that you're allowing yourself to give up your self-control, right? So you have to have trust in that other person for one. And then you have to know that I'm creating a boundary. So outside of like this scenario for maybe a few hours, I'm going to give up my power and my control to you, but I want it back and I shouldn't have to fight for it again. So this is like, that's true, because we think like our imagination is so unbelievably fertile. Like, it's just like, you can think about, and especially as our imagination is kind of coming to life as we hit adolescence and our hormones are changing, all of this is new to us and we want to be supported, and we're always looking for ways to find support around us. The internet's like, like the sky's the limit, basically, because everybody's going to be thinking about something in that regard, and they're going to have their input on it. Some people might shy away from it, and it's brand new, so there's not very much feedback. So it'll just be like there's maybe a few experts on the field, and then even then you have to go to school or some formal education to kind of get a authoritative or kind of professional perspective on something. So, I mean, how do you bring this into the mainstream outside of kind of like tentatively trying with popular culture and entertainment, and then just kind of wondering, like, where is pedagogy in all this? Like, how do we build curriculum around this? And one of the things that I loved when I was in school, I think just from even as early as kindergarten, is that we always watched films that supported whatever unit we were kind of working on. So sometimes, depending on maybe the teacher, they won't support or want to include very much entertainment, like movies or TV, depending on the feedback they might get from some parents, like, our kids could watch TV at home. It's a little bit more than that. It's more, we're trying to supplement something that's real life in a real life scenario. So school is a learning environment, home can be a learning environment, entertainment should be a learning environment, and we're trying to kind of allow people to see the bridge where, life isn't these isolated boxes where we should put, something in a box and then walk away from it and then not revisit it again until much later. So, hopefully, this can kind of enlighten us as to why power struggles are a thing within these patriarchal cultures. See, I can't talk a lot of around L words, but that and traditional cultures, and like, where is it that we can kind of find some kind of egalitarian way of being without taking away from what a woman's natural femininity is, and wanting to kind of be somebody who, maybe in the world, in the business world, I have to be a certain assertive person, but then in a family, I want to be able to put some of that away and not always have to be that like authority or like authoritarian figure or authoritative figure, and be able to relax and just like enjoy like a fun life with my kids, if that's what it is. So there's the reason I say this is because it just seems almost ironic that we say we don't want to rely on tradition, but it is kind of what has built us. So a narration in the Quran talks about how we shouldn't be like donkeys who are animals of burden, basically like they carry a huge load, that have books on their back and they have no use for them. So it's to say, like, imagine a donkey that has all this food on its back and it's starving, right? So it's walking and it's got what it needs, but it just can't reach it. So that's basically the scenario. Like, it gives you such an imagery of what we have in our tradition and our culture, but we've created such stereotypes and such stigma around it that we're almost hesitant to try. Like, if I try something and I'm caught reading this book, are people going to assume the worst of me, or are they going to give me a label, or are they going to say I'm doing it wrong, or are they going to judge like what I conclude from it? And we want to take away from that. We want to create that kind of like curiosity and know that because we're trying, God's going to already be there to inspire with us, right? Or inspire us and continue to almost like open up a new pathway for us. And then, the world will open up in ways that people will kind of be like, maybe they'll stand in our way for a little bit, just to question, like, to what degree are you going to persevere in this path, and hopefully maintain some kind of balance so you're not moving in one extreme or the other. But then eventually you'll find the support. And it's almost to say that the world may not support you at the beginning, to help you remember that you do need to rely on that omnipotent source in the world outside of what people are, what technology is, because that again is never going to be permanent. You want to build your subconscious in a way so that after, you live your full life and you die and you come back, you have that almost availability in your subconscious that'll help you continue to kind of progress to build your heaven, as it were. So I don't want to say that women should take their power back, as it were, but it's almost to say, if we are used to being in some cultures in a patriarchal society where we feel like we're bound by these rules that maybe started in the primitive world 2,000 years ago or 1,400 years ago, and we're afraid to branch out of it because of what societies might almost condemn us as, like, why don't we try to just be a little bit more like proactive and say, well, let's question this. Like, it doesn't have to be, matriarchal versus patriarchal, or like men and women, but it's almost, we've worked in this industry for a very long time, for example. We've worked with a lot of people. A lot of us are open-minded and willing to understand like why we need to grapple with these questions, because our children will be, and our grandkids probably already are. So how can we support them? And then how can we change? And how can we allow for some of the values that we have to maintain themselves, but then to support them with a little bit of a person's independent exploration with themselves is actually necessary, so that they know what limits they have for themselves and what makes them comfortable before letting someone else try that with them, right? So if I'm a person who's 20, right, and I've never explored my sexuality before, and I'm thinking I'm probably not allowed, and I have to figure out, who am I going to be safe to do that with? How am I going to know, right? And like, it's not until after like we try something together, for example, that I'll say, oh my gosh, he has no respect for like my boundary, and then like then what? And because I don't know that maybe it was a safe thing, but you're just really, really nervous and you haven't had the chance to kind of explore what you're comfortable with. How do you navigate that? So these are legitimate questions. Maybe we're shy to ask. Maybe we're new to thinking about it, because maybe like back home or whatever, these questions are almost like taboo still. Who knows? I don't know. I haven't been back home, as it were, in a very long time. And when I do go, it's rare that I interact with like my cousins or anybody who would be kind of my age. So I don't know. I just want to kind of build a safe place, or kind of convey that this should be something that we do create, like kind of like this judgment-free way of thinking about these subjects, even if they are contentious, and then wonder about what that'll kind of promote in the future as we kind of understand the importance of being almost like an authoritative source on who we are, so that we are our own expert. Our own expert can inform others about how to interact with us, and then we will have families that are more integrated with each other, and then eventually we'll have societies that are integrated with each other, rather than families who tend to fall apart and then try to build new families or blend new families and then wonder, like, why did the first one fall apart anyway? Like, we seem to be getting better, which is fine. It's good. Like, it's almost like a healthy way of saying, like, we needed that middle part to understand how societies can merge and blend, and then try to build families again, and understand, how do we define a family again anyway?